The Great Pyramid of Giza is probably the most stunning of all these ancient structures. And the stones are immense, and some of them were cut from a quarry that's hundreds of miles away. How do you think they did that?
For 4,600 years, nobody could explain it. Thousands of experts tried, all of them failed. Then one engineer working completely alone cracked the secret that archaeologists had buried for decades. What he found inside the Great Pyramid should have been impossible. The evidence was hiding in plain sight the entire time, and nobody wanted to admit it.
Well, some of them, the granite in the Great Pyramid comes from more than 500 miles to the south. If you look at the famous King's Chamber, its walls and its roof are, the ceiling of the King's Chamber are all made with gigantic granite blocks.
Stunning detail.
Stunning detail. Those blocks on the roof of the King's Chamber weigh 70 tons each.
When he finally revealed his findings, careers were threatened, reputations collapsed, and the entire field of Egyptology was forced to confront one devastating question. How did they miss this? What you are about to hear will change everything you thought you knew. Standing on the edge of the Sahara Desert, just outside modern-day Cairo, is a structure that has outlasted nearly every other thing humanity has ever built. The Great Pyramid of Giza has been standing for more than 4,600 years. For the vast majority of recorded human history, it was the tallest building on the planet. It held that title for nearly 4,000 years until Lincoln Cathedral in England surpassed it sometime around 1311. To put that into perspective, the pyramid was already ancient history by the time the medieval English decided to build a church tall enough to beat it. What makes the Great Pyramid so remarkable is not just its age, but the sheer fact that it is still here at all. It has endured earthquakes, centuries of erosion, and countless invasions. It survived the rise and fall of empires. Treasure hunters and looters have been picking at it for millennia. In the 19th century, British explorers blasted their way into it using dynamite. And still, it stands. That level of durability was not an accident. That was the entire point. The pyramid was built to last forever, because the man who commissioned it believed he was going to live forever. That man was Khufu, a pharaoh of ancient Egypt who ruled sometime around 2560 BCE. He was not just a king. In the eyes of his people, and quite possibly in his own eyes too, he was a god walking among mortals. When his body eventually died, his spirit would need somewhere worthy to spend eternity. A burial site for a god could not be flimsy, poorly designed, or easily broken into. It needed to be the most impressive and most secure structure the world had ever seen. To understand why Khufu had both the means and the ambition to build something on this scale, you have to understand what Egypt was at that time. It was, by most historical accounts, the wealthiest and most organized nation on earth. A significant part of that wealth came from the Nile. Every year, the river would overflow its banks and deposit rich, fertile soil across the surrounding land. This annual flooding allowed Egyptian farmers to grow crops in quantities far beyond what they needed to survive. That surplus fed a large and well-maintained workforce and helped sustain a powerful standing army. That army, in turn, regularly conducted raids on neighboring regions, bringing back additional wealth for the pharaoh. Khufu, in short, had access to enormous financial and human resources. He could afford to build something extraordinary. But money alone does not build a pyramid. You also need someone who knows what they are doing. For that, Khufu turned to his half-brother, Hemiunu. By most accounts, Hemiunu was an exceptional individual, a man who combined administrative authority with genuine architectural genius. He held one of the highest positions in the Egyptian state and was tasked with overseeing the design and construction of the pyramid from start to finish. What he came up with was not simply a bigger version of what had come before, it was a fundamental reimagining of what a pyramid could be. Khufu's father, the pharaoh Sneferu, had also built pyramids. Sneferu is actually credited with teaching Egypt how to build true, smooth-sided pyramids, having experimented with earlier designs that did not go entirely to plan. His bent pyramid, built at Dashur, shows a noticeable change in angle partway up, widely believed to be the result of structural concerns during construction. His red pyramid, completed shortly after, is considered the first successful true pyramid. But in Hemiunu's vision, even these impressive structures were not good enough. The Great Pyramid would be on another level entirely. The design Hemiunu settled on was centered around solid stone construction on a massive scale. Rather than a hollow or loosely filled structure, the bulk of the pyramid would consist of around 2.3 million stone blocks, with individual blocks weighing anywhere from a couple of tons to as much as 50 metric tons. The total estimated weight of the pyramid sits somewhere around 6 million tons, making it one of the heaviest objects ever built by human hands. Inside, Hemiunu planned 3 separate burial chambers, each serving a specific purpose. The first was to be built underground, directly beneath the pyramid. This was essentially a backup plan. If Khufu died, before the full project was completed, there would still be a finished chamber ready to receive him. The second chamber, sometimes referred to as the Queen's Chamber, was designed to be hidden behind a false wall. The idea was to mislead anyone who managed to get inside, making them believe they had found the burial room while the real treasures remained concealed elsewhere. The third and highest chamber, the King's Chamber, was the centerpiece of the entire design. Getting to the King's Chamber required passing through one of the most architecturally striking corridors ever constructed in the ancient world. The Grand Gallery is a long, rising passage with corbelled walls, meaning the stones are stacked in overlapping layers that lean inward as they rise, creating a tall, narrow corridor with a ceiling nearly 9 meters high. It is a stunning piece of design, and as we will see later in this series, it may also have served a very practical engineering function during the pyramid's construction. The King's Chamber itself was built entirely from pink granite, quarried at Aswan, roughly 800 kilometers to the south. The blocks fit together so tightly that even today it is not possible to slide a razor blade between them. At the center of the chamber sits a granite sarcophagus, carved from a single block of stone, where Khufu's body would eventually be laid to rest. Once the interior was complete, the entire exterior of the pyramid was to be covered in a casing of highly polished white limestone. Ancient sources suggest this casing would have made the pyramid dazzling in direct sunlight, visible from enormous distances across the desert. On top of all of this, a capstone known as a pyramidion, likely coated in gold, would sit at the very peak. Virtually all of the white limestone casing has since been stripped away over the centuries, much of it repurposed for buildings in medieval Cairo, but the core structure beneath it remains largely intact. The base of the pyramid covers an area of roughly 53,000 square meters, approximately the size of 7 New York City blocks. Despite the enormous footprint, the base is almost perfectly level, deviating by no more than about 2 centimeters across its entire surface. The 4 sides are aligned to the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west, with near-perfect accuracy. Researchers have noted that this level of astronomical alignment was achieved thousands of years before the magnetic compass existed. Exactly how the ancient Egyptians achieved this precision remains a subject of genuine academic debate. To complete the pyramid within a realistic time frame, Hemiunu estimated that the project would need somewhere in the region of 20 years and a workforce of up to 25,000 people. For a country with a total population of roughly 1 million, that was a significant undertaking. Contrary to the popular image of slaves being forced to build the pyramids, archaeological evidence uncovered in recent decades, including the remains of a workers' village near the Giza plateau, suggests that many of the builders were paid laborers. They received rations of bread, beer, and meat, and the skeletal remains of workers found at the site show evidence of medical care, including treated bone fractures and even some early surgical procedures. These were not people being worked to death in chains. They were skilled workers and laborers recruited from across Egypt to take part in what was, by any measure, the most ambitious construction project their civilization had ever attempted. With the vision in place, the resources secured, and the workforce being assembled, the real question was how exactly they were going to do it. How do you move millions of stone blocks, some heavier than a modern lorry, and stack them with sub-centimeter precision, using nothing but human muscle, rope, and wood? That question has been debated by historians, archaeologists, and engineers for centuries, and it remains, even now, without a definitive answer. When you look at the Great Pyramid today, the question that almost inevitably comes to mind is a simple one: how? How did a civilization, without cranes, without steel, without motorized vehicles, and without any of the heavy machinery we now take for granted, manage to move millions of stone blocks and stack them to a height of nearly 150 meters with extraordinary precision? It is one of the oldest and most debated questions in archaeology, and despite centuries of research, there is still no single theory that every expert agrees on. What follows are the three most scientifically credible explanations that researchers have put forward, each one building on the last in terms of complexity. The most straightforward idea, and the one that has historically attracted the most support among Egyptologists, is the external ramp theory. The basic concept is exactly what it sounds like. To get a heavy block from ground level to a higher point in the pyramid, you build a ramp and drag it up. Workers would attach ropes to a stone block, place it on a wooden sled and haul it up the slope using coordinated human effort. Wet sand or water may have been poured in front of the sled to reduce friction, a technique supported by an ancient Egyptian tomb painting discovered at Deir el-Bersha, which appears to show a large statue being dragged on a sled while a figure pours liquid at the front. It is a simple, logical approach, and there is solid archaeological evidence that the Egyptians used ramps regularly for various construction purposes. However, the external ramp theory runs into serious problems once you start doing the mathematics. To move a 2-ton block up a slope without killing your workers, you need to keep the gradient manageable. Engineering calculations suggest that an incline of around 8% is roughly the steepest that average workers could handle over sustained periods. The skeletal remains of pyramid builders show that these were not exceptional athletes. They were ordinary people doing extraordinarily hard physical labor. Many of them died before the age of 40. Pushing the incline beyond a sensible limit would have made the work unbearable and the death toll unsustainable. At an 8% gradient, a ramp reaching the full height of the pyramid would need to extend for well over 1 kilometer in length. The volume of material required to build such a ramp would be enormous, potentially several times the volume of the pyramid itself. Estimates suggest it could have required millions of tons of rubble and fill material. No remains of a ramp anywhere near that scale have ever been found near the Giza Plateau. Furthermore, building the ramp alone would have consumed a significant chunk of the 20-year construction window, leaving far less time for the actual pyramid. The external ramp, in its simplest form, works well in theory, but struggles when applied to the full height and scale of the Great Pyramid. One variation attempts to address the space problem by wrapping the ramp around the pyramid in a corkscrew pattern, spiraling upward along the outer faces rather than extending outward in a straight line. This would reduce the amount of material needed and could explain why no massive ramp remains have been found, since the spiral ramp would eventually be incorporated into the pyramid's outer casing and disappear from view. It is a clever adaptation, but it introduces a different and arguably more serious problem. Maintaining the precise geometry of the pyramid's triangular faces requires constant visual surveying of the corners and edges from a distance. A ramp spiraling around the outside would block the surveyor's sight lines, making it extremely difficult to check whether the angles were being maintained correctly. Given that the Great Pyramid's faces are aligned with near-perfect accuracy, and its corners are almost perfectly straight from base to apex, that level of precision seems very hard to achieve with a ramp obstructing the view. The second theory was developed not by an Egyptologist, but by a French engineer named Henri Houdin, who first became interested in the problem in the late 1990s after watching a television documentary. Houdin felt that the standard external ramp explanation did not satisfy him from an engineering perspective. He discussed his doubts with his son Jean-Pierre, an architect, who became equally absorbed by the puzzle. Over the following years, Jean-Pierre Houdin developed a detailed alternative theory that has since gained genuine attention within the field, partly because of the depth of engineering thinking behind it, and partly because it offers plausible explanations for several features of the pyramid that had previously seemed puzzling. Houdin's theory does not completely abandon the external ramp. Instead, it proposes that an external ramp was used during the early stages of construction for roughly the first 40 seconds, to 60 meters of height. At this stage, the pyramid is at its widest, and the blocks being moved include the heaviest ones in the entire structure, the massive granite beams that form the ceiling of the king's chamber. These beams, quarried at Aswan hundreds of kilometers to the south, weigh up to 50 tons each. Hauling them up a ramp with brute human force alone would theoretically require hundreds of workers pulling simultaneously, which is logistically very difficult in a confined space. Houdin proposes that the Grand Gallery was used to solve this specific problem. In his reading, the Grand Gallery was not merely a decorative corridor or a symbolic passageway, it was an active piece of construction machinery. He suggests that the gallery functioned as a counterweight system, with a trolley loaded with heavy stones positioned at the top of the gallery's slope, connected by rope to the granite beams being hauled up the external ramp on the other side. When the trolley was released and rolled down the gallery's incline, the weight would pull the granite beam upward. The stone benches running along the sides of the Grand Gallery, which have puzzled archaeologists for years, may have served as the rails or guides for these trolley systems. There is also evidence of repeated scuffing and wear on the surfaces of the Grand Gallery that some researchers believe is consistent with heavy loads moving through the space over an extended period. Once the granite beams were in place and the pyramid had risen beyond the practical height of the external ramp, Houdin argues that the builders switched to an entirely different approach. The external ramp was dismantled, and its blocks were reused in the pyramid itself, which would neatly explain why no large ramp remains have ever been found. From this point on, construction continued using an internal ramp, a passage spiraling upward through the interior of the pyramid itself, much like the ramp inside a multi-story car park. This ramp would have run at an incline of roughly 7%, zigzagging from one side of the pyramid to another as it climbed toward the top, with each successive flight getting shorter as the pyramid narrowed. At each turning point where the ramp changed direction, Houdin calculates that a larger open space would have been needed to allow workers to maneuver the blocks around the corner, possibly using wooden levers or simple cranes. One piece of physical evidence that Houdin points to is a previously unexplained notch in the outer surface of the pyramid at a height of approximately 83 meters, which corresponds closely to where his model predicts one of these turning spaces would have been located. It is not conclusive proof, but it is the kind of specific, testable prediction that gives the theory a level of credibility that more general speculation lacks. Critics of Houdin's theory have raised concerns about its complexity. Some argue that designing a hidden internal ramp that navigates around the pyramid's internal chambers, passageways, and structural elements would require an extraordinarily detailed architectural plan. The ramp's path would need to be worked out in advance with great care to avoid intersecting with any of the known interior spaces. Others question whether the archaeological evidence for the internal ramp is strong enough to consider it more than an interesting hypothesis. Supporters counter that the ancient Egyptians demonstrably worked to exceptional standards of precision across many aspects of their construction, and that the complexity of the approach should not automatically be used as a reason to dismiss it. The third theory is the most recent and, by some distance, the most unconventional. In 2024, a peer-reviewed study put forward the idea that the ancient Egyptians may have used water, specifically a hydraulically powered lift system, to raise heavy stones during construction. The broader context for this theory begins with a separate 2024 study that used radar satellite imaging combined with deep soil analysis to identify what appears to be a long-lost branch of the Nile that once ran much closer to the Giza plateau than the river does today. During the period when the pyramids were being built, this branch may have allowed stone blocks to be transported by boat directly to the construction site, avoiding the enormous effort of dragging them overland across the desert from distant quarries. The hydraulic lift theory takes this water connection a step further. The researchers, whose team included hydrologists, mechanical engineers, and geographers, proposed that rainfall and floodwater could have been collected in a structure functioning as a dam and then directed through a network of underground channels into a central vertical shaft running up through the interior of the pyramid. Within this shaft, a large wooden platform would float on the water's surface. Workers would load heavy stone blocks onto the platform at ground level, then manipulate valves to raise or lower the water level in the shaft, causing the platform to rise like a lift. At the desired height, workers would unload the blocks and use them in the ongoing construction. The theory is creative and at first glance surprisingly coherent, but the response from established Egyptologists has been largely skeptical. Zahi Hawass, one of the most prominent figures in the field, has described the theory as fundamentally flawed, pointing out that the pyramid examined in the 2024 study is significantly smaller than the Great Pyramid and constructed from much lighter materials. Scaling the concept up to match the dimensions and weight requirements of Khufu's pyramid would require a considerably larger and more complex hydraulic system, for which there is currently no direct archaeological evidence. No shaft of the kind described has been identified within the Great Pyramid itself. Ramps, by contrast, have been found at numerous da'ats, ancient Egyptian construction sites, which is a significant reason why ramp-based theories continue to dominate mainstream thinking. None of the three theories is without its weaknesses. None has been universally accepted. And it is entirely possible that the real answer involves a combination of methods, different techniques applied at different stages of construction as the pyramid grew and the engineering challenges changed. What all three theories share is a recognition that whatever the Egyptians did, it worked, and it worked at a scale and with a level of precision that engineers and archaeologists are still struggling to fully account for today. For all the research, all the theories, and all the technological tools that modern science has brought to bear on the Great Pyramid, there is a striking and somewhat uncomfortable truth that sits at the center of the whole discussion. We still do not fully understand how it was built, and the mystery does not stop there. In many ways, the construction question is just the beginning. One of the most quietly puzzling aspects of the Great Pyramid is the almost complete absence of written records relating to its construction. This is not for lack of documentation in ancient Egypt more broadly. The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. Archaeologists have recovered tax records, personal letters, religious texts, medical documents, and even mundane administrative notes about food supplies and livestock from thousands of years ago. The ancient Egyptians wrote things down. They kept track of things. And yet, despite all of that, no architectural blueprints or detailed construction plans for the pyramids have ever been found. Whether those documents were lost over time, deliberately destroyed, or are simply waiting to be discovered, somewhere has never been established. Their absence remains one of the quieter but more genuinely strange aspects of the whole story. What has been found, however, is something remarkable in its own right. In 2013, a team of archaeologists excavating a storage cave near the Red Sea port of Wadi al-Jarf uncovered what are believed to be the oldest papyrus documents ever found in Egypt. Among them were the logbook entries of an official named Mera, who was directly involved in the construction of the Great Pyramid. His records describe the transportation of white limestone casing blocks from quarries at Tura, across the Nile, and along canals to the Giza Plateau. It is first-hand, contemporary documentation of pyramid construction in progress, and it represents one of the most significant archaeological finds related to the pyramids in recent history. But even Mera's detailed records do not answer the central question of how the blocks were lifted into place. They tell us about the supply chain, not the building method. More recently, technology has started to reveal things about the pyramid's interior that no human has seen in thousands of years, if ever. In 2017, a team of scientists working under the Scan Pyramids project announced a significant discovery. Using a technique called muon tomography, which involves detecting the behavior of high-energy particles that pass through solid matter at different rates depending on density, the researchers identified a large void deep within the pyramid. The space, which sits above the Grand Gallery, is estimated to be at least 30 meters long. It does not correspond to any known chamber or passageway. Its existence was entirely unexpected. The interpretation of this void has been a source of considerable discussion among researchers ever since. One practical explanation, favored by a number of structural archaeologists, is that the space is not a hidden room at all, but rather a deliberate engineering feature. Large empty spaces built above interior chambers would help distribute the enormous weight of the stone above, reducing pressure on the ceilings below and preventing collapse over time. Similar, stress-relieving chambers are already known to exist above the king's chamber, so the idea is not without precedent. Another school of thought suggests the void may be connected to the Grand Gallery counterweight theory, potentially representing a space that was used during construction and then sealed off once it was no longer needed. And then there are those, including Zahi Hawass, who have suggested the possibility that the void could be Khufu's actual burial chamber, separate from the king's chamber that tourists visit today. That last suggestion points to what is arguably the greatest unsolved mystery connected to the Great Pyramid. Khufu's mummy has never been found. The king's chamber, when explorers first documented its interior in modern times, contained only an empty granite sarcophagus with no lid and no body. No treasure, no grave goods, nothing that you would expect from a royal burial of that magnitude. Whether the chamber was looted in antiquity, whether the burial was always intended to be somewhere else, or whether Khufu's remains are still hidden somewhere inside the pyramid waiting to be found, nobody knows. For a structure built with the explicit purpose of housing a pharaoh for eternity, the absence of that pharaoh is a detail that has never stopped being strange. The Scan Pyramids project is ongoing, and researchers continue to apply new imaging and sensing technologies to the pyramid in the hope of learning more about what lies inside. Non-invasive techniques are now capable of detecting features that would have been completely invisible to earlier generations of archaeologists, and each new survey has the potential to change what we think we know. The discovery of the large void in 2017 demonstrated that even a structure this well-studied can still hold genuine surprises. What all of this points to is the fact that the Great Pyramid is not simply an old building whose secrets have mostly been worked out. It is an active subject of scientific investigation, with new findings continuing to emerge and established assumptions being regularly challenged. The 2024 studies into the Lost Nile branch and the hydraulic lift theory are just the latest examples of researchers approaching the pyramid from new angles and finding things that were not previously part of the conversation. There is also a broader point worth making about how we talk about discoveries related to the pyramids. Every few years, a headline appears claiming that the mystery has finally been solved, that some new piece of evidence has settled the debate once and for all. It is worth approaching those claims with a degree of caution. The pyramid has been studied intensively for centuries, and the honest position, the one that most careful researchers would endorse, is that we have learned a great deal, but we are still far from a complete picture. Archaeology moves slowly, and the distance between an interesting new finding and a definitive conclusion is usually much larger than the headlines suggest. What we are left with then is a structure that continues to resist full explanation, despite being one of the most examined objects in human history. It was built by real people using real materials and real tools within a real historical and political context that we understand reasonably well. The vision behind it was clear, the ambition was enormous, and the result was a building that has outlasted virtually everything else its civilization produced. The Great Pyramid is the only one of the original 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing. It was already thousands of years old when Cleopatra was alive. Julius Caesar saw it, Napoleon camped near it, and it will almost certainly still be standing long after every building currently on Earth has crumbled. The full story of how it was built and what secrets it may still contain has not yet been written, but the tools, the techniques, and the curiosity needed to keep working toward that answer are better than they have ever been. Whatever comes next, the pyramid will still be there, waiting.